I've described how I wrote my most recent book, Perspective and Guidance, for a time of deep discord because of great concern I feel about how with issues of every sort, people today are dividing almost immediately into polar camps. Extreme polarization is setting neighbor against neighbor, creating distractions that get in the way of addressing essential questions and often very directly putting it at risk. After addressing causes with each chapter in the book, I illustrate how we might bring culturally mature perspective to one issue where divisiveness too often prevails. I chose concerns I did because each has something particular to teach us about addressing issues more systemically. The abortion question brings us back to the essential recognition that I highlighted with episode number 12 that brought culturally mature perspective to moral concerns more generally. The importance of thinking in terms of competing goods. It also, in another way, brings us back to episode 9 with the need to confront limits, and in the end, quite ultimate limits. I've noted that a basic observation provides the architecture for the book. In times past, when we encountered polarized positions and partisan advocacy, our task was obvious and unquestioned. We assumed there were only two options, and our job was to figure out which one was right and fight for it. As we look to the future, polarization has very different implications. We recognize that what we are seeing is left and right hands of a larger systemic picture. We also see that neither side has yet to ask the larger hard questions that ultimately need to be addressed. Abortion is an issue that we commonly associate with irreconcilable differences. But we also today find polarization becoming even more extreme. Certainly, opinion has come to more clearly divide along party lines. For example, in the 1970s, Republican President Gerald Ford opposed Roe v. Wade, while First Lady Betty Ford and Ford's Vice President Nelson Rockefeller were abortion rights supporters. It is an issue where people today rarely succeed in finding common ground. But precisely because the abortion question so quickly splits people into opposing camps, it has a lot to teach us. We encounter what today is likely the main reason behind such extreme disparity of belief in the previous episode. There I propose that the healthcare delivery debate in the end becomes so deeply contentious because it brings us face to face with life's ultimate limit, the fact that we die. More specifically, it requires that we make conscious choices in the face of death. Abortion, in a related way, confronts us with questions of life and death, and whatever our position, in the end, it similarly requires that we make life and death-related choices. Consulting work I did a few years back with a social services agency provides a way in. Abortion had become a hot-button issue in the organization, and contentious feelings were getting in the way of people working together effectively. I introduced the method I called parts work in chapter number 5. Chapter number 5. There I mentioned that I often use the same general kind of approach with groups. I am particularly likely to do so with groups that are experiencing internal conflicts or where a group is dealing with controversial issues. When working in this way, I start by having individuals or small subgroups representing the competing voices. A second group, sitting separate from them, assumes the role of the whole person, whole system chair, culturally mature chair. People in the second group are given a sequence of tasks. First, they engage the advocate groups in conversation to clarify the divergent positions. They then converse amongst themselves and seek to find larger ways of thinking. And finally, they attempt to articulate conclusions and describe how these larger ways of understanding might translate into right and timely action. In working with the organization, I began by separating out two groups to speak for the pro-life and pro-choice positions. And to make things more interesting, I switched the groups so that people in each group had to argue for a position opposite to what they actually believed. I then had people who actually held these positions be consultants to help the advocates effectively make their arguments. The rest of the participants, those tasked with finding larger perspective, sat in a circle around the advocate groups. To start the process, the two small groups spoke in turn, with the consultants coaching so that advocates didn't miss important points. The main arguments were those we commonly hear. The pro-life group argued that abortion was murder. The pro-choice group countered that the decision should be in the hands of the woman, or the woman with her doctor. Next, I invited people in the outer circle to ask curiosity questions. Initially, their task was simply to clarify positions. The process allows no debate at this point. While this helped fill out understanding, it failed to provide much that altered the conversation. The positions of the two groups continued to appear mutually exclusive. The people in the outer circle then took on the further task of attempting to engage the issue of abortion more systemically. Initially, I had them discuss quietly in pairs. With time, I had them share together and do their best to articulate their conclusions. While the outer group's efforts didn't provide final answers, the reflections did gradually move the conversation from a debate about right and wrong to interactions that acknowledge legitimate feelings on both sides. Several contributions proved particularly useful in this regard. A man who leaned more pro-choice offered that he found it impossible to escape that abortion was in fact a kind of killing, that at least it was the ending of a potential life. He briefly apologized to his pro-choice colleagues that they might not be happy with his conclusions, but he quickly went on to suggest that denying this reality was only hiding from the real question and made real conversation impossible. And in the end, it simply left out what he felt was an essential fact. A woman who leaned more pro-life at first also apologized, observing that while what she had to offer had helped her, others might find it too philosophical. She described how she had found herself questioning whether death was the right way to think about the opposite of life. She struggled to find words that might express a better way of thinking about it, but eventually she proposed that maybe instead of being pro-life in a literal sense, people needed to think instead in terms of what most ultimately honored life. And while she wasn't quite sure what that meant, she also offered that being sure that life endured might not be the only way to do so. Several of her colleagues countered that such semantics accomplished nothing, that death could not be consistent with life, but the observation did invite people to begin to stretch their assumptions. Conversations continued on for about an hour, going back and forth between the two advocacy groups and the people tasked with finding a larger picture, where rarely was there full agreement, but the stated goal of generating greater mutual respect was gradually achieved. People were able to get to the place where productive conversation at least became possible. I noted in episode number 12 that the abortion question provides a prime example of the need to think in terms of competing goods. It pits the sanctity of life against a woman's right to choose. Each is clearly a good and an important kind of good. People aren't used to thinking in terms of competing goods, and the task is compounded by a further circumstance that we commonly find with thorny issues. Each position advocates for very different kinds of goods. Caught with such apples and oranges considerations, we confront major difficulties not just because different people may value one good as opposed to the other. Because we are dealing with wholly different concerns, there is no way we can meet halfway, even if we were inclined to do so. But the concept of cultural maturity suggests that we can get at the larger, more systemic question that underlies the polar debates. We can make at least a start. What might that be with the abortion debate? Traditionally, the defining question with abortion concerns has been when life begins. Those of more conservative bent will claim it begins at conception, or at least at the time of first fetal heartbeat. Those of more liberal inclination will tend to answer the question in terms of viability. But the when does life begin question proves much less helpful than we might imagine. Because each answer is in its own way legitimate, there is no clear justification for choosing one over the other. The viability answer also confronts the fact that as medical science has improved, this measure has become a moving target. There is in fact a larger question that can at least begin to take us forward, one that we hear hinted at in the responses of each of the outer circle contributors in the group parts work example. The better question asks what choices are most ultimately life-affirming, in the sense specifically of supporting life as something we experience as meaningful. I propose that this is the question that all moral concerns come back to when viewed systemically. This kind of determination is less objective. It is not something we can discern at a safe arm's length, and people can continue to disagree when they answer it, but arguably it gets more directly at what is important. Framing the question in this way at least begins to provide a basis for conversation. Note that at the same time it supports and also challenges the positions of both the right and the left. In Parts Work's terms, presents yeses and nos for each side. For the right, it affirms that the fact of life is a good, the yes. But at once it requires acknowledging both that when life begins is open for debate and that existence is not the only variable when it comes to meaningful life, the no. For the left, it supports the importance of a woman's right to choose, the yes in doing Parts Work. But at the same time, it requires the left to acknowledge that abortion does in fact end a possible life, the complementary Parts Work, no. As we've seen with other issues, just identifying a more systemic way of thinking doesn't provide an answer that will be acceptable to everyone. Few people will find this way of framing the abortion question wholly satisfying. The main reason is the explanation that I offered earlier for why the abortion issue is so fraught. Abortion brings us face to face with death. But we can also think of the reason in terms of any of the needed new skills and capacities I've noted. Certainly, framing the abortion question more systemically confers new responsibility, and of the ultimate sort I've pointed toward. It makes us newly responsible not just for choosing correctly, but for the truths on which we base our choices. With a culturally mature perspective, we see that accepting this greater responsibility becomes part of what it means to be moral in our time. But taking this new level of responsibility in the truths we draw on is not something we are used to doing. It is also the case that we can't really approach the abortion question more systemically without confronting the need for each of the more specific new skills and capacities I've noted. We need to accept the fact that choices are complex, and inevitably we need to acknowledge that the act of choosing involves real uncertainty. Like it or not, we find real limits, at least with regard to the usefulness of more ideological ways of thinking, but also ultimately to what anyone can know for sure. We also again confront the fact of truth's contextual relativity. How we might answer the abortion question is going to be influenced by the degree to which we can tolerate a more systemic picture and manifest these new skills and capacities. It can also be influenced by personality style, and how abortion is viewed can also be very different depending on life circumstances, such as religious background. Once again, we encounter our familiar paradox. Addressing a question like abortion with the needed apples and oranges sophistication requires thinking in ways that are more demanding and detailed than we're used to. Yet at the same time, there are ways in which it is ultimately straightforward. Nothing more defines us than the fact that we are alive, and alive in the particularly choiceful and creative way that makes us human. In the end, reconciling the abortion debate is about making life in that sense or referent. Hold life large enough, and that becomes common sense. As always, I invite your thoughts and your questions.